Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly, but now it was impossible to ignore. His fingers absently traced the edge of the comforter, the gesture more delicate than he'd ever remember being. Frowning, he forced his hand to stop, clenching it into a fist instead. This wasn't like him. None of this was like him. "Get it together," he muttered, his voice sounding strangely soft in the darkness of the bedroom. Rolling onto his side, he tried to find a comfortable position, but everything felt wrong. His body didn't seem to fit right anymore, as if he were wearing a suit that had shrunk in the wash. Frustration mounting, he kicked off the covers and sat up, running a hand through his hair. His fingers caught on unexpected length, and he froze. Slowly, almost afraid of what he'd find, he pulled a strand forward into view. Even in the dim light filtering through the curtains, he could see it was longer than it should be. Much longer. Heart racing, he stumbled out of bed and fumbled for the light switch. The sudden brightness made him squint, but as his eyes adjusted, the mirror on the closet door captured his attention. The reflection staring back at him was different. Subtle changes that he couldn't quite pin down, but enough to make him feel like a stranger in his own skin. A knock at the door made him jump. "Hey, you okay in there?" Solomon's voice came through, tinged with concern. "Heard you moving around." He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just couldn't sleep." "All right, man. Try to get some rest, yeah?" "Sure thing," he replied, wincing at how his voice sounded. Had it always been that high? As Solomon's footsteps faded down the hall, he turned back to the mirror, studying his reflection intently. His face seemed softer somehow, the angles less defined. And his hair. It wasn't just longer, it looked styled, falling in gentle waves around his face. "This isn't happening," he whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek. The skin felt smoother than he remembered, almost velvety beneath his fingertips. Shaking his head, he flicked off the light and crawled back into bed. It was late, he was tired, and his mind was playing tricks on him. In the morning, everything would be back to normal. It had to be. But as dawn broke, streaking the sky with hues of pink and gold, nothing had changed. If anything, the differences were more pronounced in the harsh light of day. His pajamas hung differently on his frame. Panic rising in his throat, he rushed to the bathroom, locking the door behind him. The full-length mirror on the back of the door offered no comfort, only confirmation of his fears. His body was changing, becoming more feminine. No, he muttered, running his hands over his face, down his neck, across his chest. Everything felt wrong, alien. A knock at the door made him jump. "Bathroom's all yours," Solomon called out. He froze, suddenly terrified of facing his roommate. Would Solomon notice the changes? How could he not? Thanks," he managed to reply, wincing at the sound of his voice. "I'll be out in a minute." Splashing cold water on his face, he tried to pull himself together. He had to act normal, had to pretend everything was fine until he could figure out what was happening to him. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. Solomon was in the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the apartment. "Morning," Solomon said without looking up from his phone. "There's coffee if you want some." Heart pounding, he made his way to the kitchen, trying to walk as normally as possible. But his hips seemed to have a mind of their own, swaying in a decidedly feminine manner. "Thanks," he mumbled, reaching for a mug. His hand trembled slightly as he poured the coffee, spilling a few drops on the counter. Solomon glanced up, brow furrowing. "You okay? You seem a bit off." "I'm fine," he said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." Solomon nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. "Well, try to get some rest tonight. We've got that presentation tomorrow, remember?" "The presentation,"
He'd completely forgotten. Panic surged through him anew. How was he supposed to stand in front of a room full of people when he barely recognized himself? "Right," he managed to say. "The presentation. Got it."
As Solomon headed off to get ready for work, he retreated to his room, coffee forgotten on the counter. Closing the door behind him, he leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of dream or hallucination or something. Anything but real. But as he caught sight of himself in the mirror again, he knew he couldn't deny it anymore. The changes were real, and they were happening fast. His hair, which had been short and neatly trimmed just days ago, now fell past his shoulders in soft waves. His face was undeniably more feminine, with fuller lips and softer features, and his body. He could see the outline of breasts pushing against his t-shirt, his waist narrower, hips wider. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, voice cracking with emotion. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of his usual routine while feeling completely disconnected from his own body. Every movement felt foreign, every gesture unfamiliar. As evening approached, Solomon returned home, barely sparing him a glance as he headed to his room to change. It was as if he didn't even notice the drastic changes that had occurred. Confused and increasingly desperate, he retreated to his own room, locking the door behind him. He couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. He needed answers. Pulling out his laptop, he began to search for any information that might explain what was happening to him. But after hours of fruitless searching, he was no closer to understanding his transformation. Exhausted and overwhelmed, he finally fell into a fitful sleep, hoping against hope that he would wake up and find it had all been a bizarre dream. But as sunlight streamed through the curtains the next morning, reality came crashing down. The changes hadn't reversed overnight. If anything, they had progressed further. Staring at his reflection in the mirror, he barely recognized the person looking back at him. Long, flowing hair framed a delicate face with large, expressive eyes. His body was unmistakably female now. A knock at the door startled him out of his daze.
"Hey, you almost ready?"
Solomon called out.
"We need to leave for the presentation in 20 minutes.
The presentation. He'd completely forgotten about it again. Panic seized him as he realized he couldn't possibly go out in public like this. I'm not feeling well," he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't think I can make it to the presentation." There was a pause. Then Solomon's voice came again, tinged with concern. "Are you sure? This is a big deal for the company. Can you push through it?" He closed his eyes, fighting back tears of frustration and fear.
"I'm sorry, I just can't. You'll have to do it without me."
Another pause, longer this time.
"All right, if you're sure. Get some rest, okay? I'll check on you when I get back."
As Solomon's footsteps faded away, he sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the reality of his situation. He couldn't hide in his room forever, but he had no idea how to face the world in this new body. The day passed in a blur of anxiety and confusion. He alternated between pacing his room and staring at his reflection, trying to reconcile the person he saw in the mirror with the person he knew himself to be. When Solomon returned home that evening, he braced himself for questions, for concern, for any indication that his roommate had finally noticed the drastic changes. But Solomon simply called out a greeting and asked if he was feeling any better. Yeah, a bit," he replied, voice soft and unfamiliar to his own ears.
"Good to hear,"
Solomon said.
"There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you're hungry."
And that was it. No comments on his appearance, no questions about the sudden emergence of feminine features. It was as if Solomon was completely blind to the transformation. As days turned into weeks, he found himself struggling to maintain his old routines in this new body. Simple tasks like getting dressed became exercises in frustration as he tried to make his old clothes fit a form they were never meant to accommodate. His wardrobe began to change, almost of its own accord. Clothes that had once been baggy and masculine now fit snugly, accentuating his new curves. He found himself reaching for softer fabrics, more fitted styles, without even realizing it. One morning, as he was getting ready for the day, he caught himself applying lip gloss without even thinking about it. He stared at his reflection in shock, the glossy pink shine on his lips a stark reminder of how much had changed. "What am I doing?" he whispered, wiping the gloss off with the back of his hand. But even as he tried to resist these new behaviors, he found himself slipping into them more and more often. His movements became more graceful, his mannerisms more feminine. It was as if his body knew how to be female better than he did. The physical changes continued as well. His voice settled into a higher register, soft and melodious. His skin became smoother, almost glowing. Even his scent changed, becoming sweeter and more floral. Through it all, Solomon remained oblivious. Their interactions continued as they always had, with his roommate seeming not to notice anything amiss. It was both a relief and a source of intense frustration. How could Solomon not see what was happening? As weeks turned into months, he found himself slowly, reluctantly beginning to adapt to his new reality. The initial panic and confusion gave way to a sort of resigned acceptance. This was who he was now, whether he understood it or not. He started venturing out of the apartment more, at first just for quick trips to the store or short walks around the neighborhood. To his amazement, no one seemed to react to his appearance. It was as if the world saw him as he now was, with no memory of who he had been before. One day, while out running errands, he caught his reflection in a store window and was struck by how natural he looked. The flowing sundress, the delicate sandals, the long hair cascading down his back. It all seemed to fit perfectly. For a moment, he felt a spark of something like contentment. Then reality crashed back in, and he hurried home, conflicted and confused. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he found himself wondering if he should start using different pronouns. The thought sent a jolt through him. Was he really considering that? Had he truly accepted this change so completely? But as the days wore on, it became increasingly difficult to think of himself as he. His body, his mannerisms, his entire way of being in the world was undeniably female now. Finally, one morning, looking at herself in the mirror, she made a decision. If this was who she was now, she would embrace it fully. No more fighting, no more denial. "Hello," she said softly to her reflection, her voice clear and feminine. "I'm her now." It felt strange, but also oddly right. A weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying seemed to lift from her shoulders. From that moment on, she allowed herself to fully inhabit her new identity. She bought new clothes that actually fit, learned how to style her hair, even started experimenting with makeup. Solomon, of course, noticed nothing different. He continued to treat her exactly as he always had, using her old name and pronouns without hesitation. It was both a comfort and a source of deep sadness. Part of her longed to tell him, to explain what had happened, but how could she when he didn't even seem to see the change? As she settled into her new life, she found herself facing unexpected challenges. Using public restrooms became an exercise in anxiety. Interactions with old friends and colleagues were fraught with tension as she waited for them to comment on her transformation. Comments that never came. But there were moments of joy, too. The first time she wore a dress and felt truly beautiful. The day she mastered the perfect cat-eye eyeliner. The evening she went out with some new friends and felt, for the first time, like she truly belonged. Months turned into a year, and her old life began to feel like a distant memory. She had a new job now, one where no one had known her before. She had new friends, a new wardrobe, a new way of moving through the world. But living with Solomon remained a constant reminder of what she had been, of the life she had left behind. Every time he used her old name, every casual "hey man" or "dude" was like a tiny knife to her heart. Finally, she knew she had to make a change. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, straddling two worlds. She had to fully embrace who she was now, even if it meant leaving her old life behind completely. With a heavy heart, she began looking for a new place to live. It felt like a betrayal, abandoning Solomon without explanation, but she couldn't see any other way forward. The day she signed the lease on her new apartment was bittersweet. As she packed up her things, carefully wrapping up the last vestiges of her old life, she felt a mix of excitement and deep sadness. Solomon helped her move, of course, still seemingly oblivious to the profound changes she had undergone. As they carried the last box into her new place, she felt a lump form in her throat. "Thanks for everything," she said softly, fighting back tears. Solomon smiled, pulling her into a hug. "That's what friends are for, right? You know you can always count on me." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As Solomon left, promising to visit soon, she closed the door behind him and leaned against it, finally allowing the tears to fall. This was it, a new chapter in a life she never could have imagined. As she looked around her new apartment, she felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. Who would she become in this new space? What adventures lay ahead? Taking a deep breath, she straightened up and wiped away her tears. Whatever the future held, she would face it as her true self. No more hiding, no more pretending. She was who she was now, and that was enough. As she settled into her new life, she found herself facing a whole new set of challenges. Simple things like updating her ID and other legal documents became complicated ordeals. How could she explain a change so drastic when she barely understood it herself? But slowly, surely, she began to build a life that felt authentically hers. She made new friends, people who had never known her as anyone but who she was now. She explored new interests, discovering a passion for painting that she'd never known before. Her relationship with Solomon evolved too. They still met up occasionally, grabbing coffee or catching a movie. But there was always an undercurrent of tension, a barrier she couldn't quite break through. How could she explain to him what had happened when he didn't even seem to see the change? One day, about 6 months after she'd moved out, she ran into an old colleague while out shopping. Her heart raced as the woman approached, certain that this time, finally, someone would acknowledge the transformation. "Hey," the woman said, smiling brightly. "It's been ages. How have you been?" She waited for the double take, the widening of eyes, any sign of recognition that she was not who she had once been. But it never came. They chatted for a few minutes, catching up on work and mutual acquaintances, and not once did the woman give any indication that anything was amiss. As they parted ways, she felt a familiar mix of relief and frustration. Was she the only one who remembered who she used to be? Was she losing her mind? That night, unable to sleep, she found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. Pictures of her old self stared back at her, a stranger with familiar eyes. She traced the outline of her former face, marveling at how different she looked now. On a whim, she decided to post one of the old photos on social media, curious to see how people would react. Would they finally notice the change? But as likes and comments started rolling in, her heart sank. No one seemed to see anything unusual. Friends commented on the memory, asking where the photo was taken, but not a single person remarked on how different she looked now. Overwhelmed, she deleted the post and threw her phone across the room, curling up in bed as tears streamed down her face. She had never felt so alone, so isolated in her experience. The next morning, she woke with a newfound determination. If no one else could see or understand what had happened to her, she would have to find a way to accept it on her own terms. She started keeping a journal, documenting the changes she'd undergone, both physical and emotional. She wrote about her fears, her confusion, her moments of joy in discovering this new self. It became a lifeline, a way to validate her experience even if no one else could see it. As months passed, she found herself growing more comfortable in her skin. The constant anxiety about being found out began to fade. She started to see her transformation not as something that had happened to her, but as an integral part of who she was. She even began to date, nervously at first, always worried that somehow her past would come to light. But as she met new people who had never known her before, she found a freedom she'd never experienced. One evening, while out on a date with a woman she'd been seeing for a few weeks, she felt a sudden urge to share her story. Thanks for watching. Check out Patreon if you want to have early access to the other parts. If not, it will be online in a couple of days.